Open your Bibles, if you will, to Exodus, the 12th chapter. Our study today will be in Exodus 12 through the first 16 verses of Exodus 13. We're continuing our study of the book of Exodus, the goodness and severity of God. And this is lesson 6. We'll be talking about the Passover and the 10th plague. But in regards to that, we're also going to consider not only these two events, but some key ideas, some specific words that I think will help us to better understand these events and use what we learn from these events to help us in serving the Lord. As we begin reading, in the very beginning of chapter 12, we see the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household." You can see here that the Lord is telling his people that the things that they've seen in Egypt, the things they've learned in Egypt, the things that have been a part of them for generations are going to change. And it's going to even be the time that they keep, because now shall be the first month for them. This should be the beginning of how they shall keep time in God's way. As we'll see throughout the law, the feasts are tied to various months, various times, and these are times that God has set. They're not the pagan times. They're not the times that the people of Egypt would have observed. As I mentioned in the write-up that was for this section, the Egyptians observed 10-day weeks. They observed 3 seasons, and these seasons were tied to the Nile River and what was going on with the Nile River, the activity of the Nile River, whether it was flooded or whether it was low. And they were to leave all that behind. They were going to be God's people, and they were going to worship God in God's way. And so at the very beginning, as he starts telling them what they're supposed to do, he puts down this idea of time will start from now. From your deliverance from Egypt will be the beginning of time for you. And this is how we're going to count time as I give you the feasts, as I lay out the things you're supposed to do as you become my people and travel to the promised land. Now, if we look specifically at this verse, there's some things I want to point out. I want you to look at how just in these few verses here, the idea of shall be or shall take is used. Now, this is given, as it says here, in the land of Egypt. We typically think of the law as being that which was given on Sinai, and it's referred to in the scriptures as that which was given on Sinai. But here we see the Lord giving the law, some aspects of the law, to the children of Israel long before Sinai, here in the land of Egypt, as is pointed out. And he's going to tell them several things here they need to do. And one phrase that we'll see over and over again is this idea of shall be or shall do or shall take, this idea of a law. And we'll talk about that in a moment as we look at some of the words we're going to look at in this section. But also take notice of the fact here that he uses the idea of congregation, the assembly of the Lord's people. These are the people of God. Remember, we said that God has told Abraham, I will be to them a God. And then he comes here and he starts calling them, let my people go. And so now he takes them as his people. And he's about to set forth what he wants them to do in service to him, how he wants them to sacrifice to him, how he wants them to worship him. And so he starts calling them here literally the congregation of Israel, the community of Israel. They're no longer just the children of Israel, no longer just the servants that are in Egypt, but they're now the congregation of Israel. In Exodus 12, beginning in verse 27, we read, "It is a sacrifice for the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." Now, this is kind of the other aspect that I wanted to look at here in regards to this idea of the law being given to the children of Israel, because he specifically talks about the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, and we'll talk about that some more. But he also, it says here that they did as the Lord commanded. The law was given here. Not all the law, not the majority of the law, but the law begins here in the sense that here are things that the children of Israel, the congregation of Israel, the people of God are supposed to do. And the Lord tells them here in Egypt what they're supposed to do. And notice their response. And the people bowed their heads and worshiped. This brings to mind what we read back in the 4th chapter in the 31st verse, after they had heard from Moses and Aaron that God was going to deliver them. It says they believed and bowed their heads and worshiped. So we see here the response of the children of Israel to the commands that the Lord has given. Not only did they bow their head and worship, but they did exactly as they were commanded to do. Here's a chart that's got 6 different words we're going to look at some detail as we look at this chapter and a half here in Exodus. And the first one is the idea of law. Now, I've already mentioned that in the very first 3 verses, the idea of shall, take, shall, do comes across. And that word is used a lot here in chapter 12. As a matter of fact, to give you a little exercise to do, we typically think of this idea of what you shall and shall not do as coming across in the 10 Commandments and the law is given on Sinai. And most of us can quote many, if not all, of those commandments in Exodus 20. We'll compare Exodus 20 and Exodus 12 here in your English Bible. If you're using the King James or the English Standard, count the number of times shall is used in chapter 12 versus chapter 20. Now, I'm not going to tell you the answer, but if you go and do that exercise, I think you'll find that it's used far more here in chapter 12 than it is used in chapter 20. Now, chapter 20 is dealing with a variety of subjects and gives us what we know as the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, the base laws upon which much of the rest of the laws are built. But nevertheless, the law is given here. And in this very context, we also see in chapter 12 and chapter 13 words such as statutes and ordinances. The idea that it's a law and it's given here and that they needed to follow it. We see that they did follow it. We see that they did as the Lord asked them to do. But notice the law is given here because it's what they needed. It's what they needed to know to do so that they could be pleasing to God, so that they could find favor in God's sight, so that they could obtain his mercy in this situation. Because remember, this is being given here, the Passover, just before the 10th plague. We see a break here in the narrative. We've seen these plagues, one after another, these signs, these wonders, these judgments going on. And now we see a break. And during this break in time, we are told a lot more about what's going on. And we're told specifically what the Lord tells Moses and what Moses tells the people that they're to do in preparation for the 10th plague. And that comes across as you shall do this. This is the statute. This is the ordinance. This is what you need to do. God is going to pass over them. God is going to spare them. But it's conditional. It's conditional upon them doing certain things. And we're going to see that here in this passage. The other idea here is this idea of congregation. And as I included in the notes for this class, this word that is translated congregation, or maybe in your translation community, is used over 100 times in Exodus and Joshua to describe the people of Israel. Mainly it means the whole group of Israel. But it's first used here in chapter 12 and verse 3. Because you see, God is now about to prepare them to leave Egypt. They're now going to be his people. He's been telling Pharaoh, let my people go. He's been telling Moses, you're going to lead my people out. Well, now the people of God are identified as a group, a gathering, an assembly. They're one nation. They belong to God. And we're going to see this word used over and over and over again, not only in this context, but throughout the next several books as we read through the law and we read through Joshua. This idea that these are the people of God and their congregation, a word we frequently use today to describe the Lord's people in a locale. A description of how we are not only a family, but a community, a congregation, an assembly of the Lord's people. And so this is something that God gave to the children of Israel before he ever brought them out of Egypt, this idea that they're a community. And it's an idea that carries down even to us today in this time and this place. As we go further in Exodus chapter 12, we can go down to verses 12 and 13. He's described up to this point, from the verses we left in verse 3 up until verse 12, of what they were to do with the land, how they were to prepare the land, how they were to take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorpost. But notice what he says here in verses 13 and 14. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for a memorial day, and ye shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. Ye shall keep a feast. Look at all the things that are included in these verses here. The idea of passing over, defining what Passover means. Literally, God would pass over or step over the children of Israel. But also that it was to be a memorial, kept throughout the generations. It was a statute to be kept by the children of Israel, a law that they were to observe. Now, why did they need the blood on the doorpost? Do you think God didn't understand who his people were? He came to them. He revealed himself to them. He had given them guidance. During the plagues, he had separated the land that they were in so that the Israelites weren't touched with some of the plagues. He knew his people. Notice what the very first phrase says. This blood shall be a sign for you. It's not a sign for God. He says, I will see the blood, I will pass over, but the sign was for them. The blood shall be a sign for you. They would understand that there was a sacrifice that had to be given. Blood had to be shed so that they could be redeemed, so that they could be spared the death that was going to come upon Egypt. It was something visible they had to do. It was indeed a condition for them. A sign for you on their house where they are, so that God would pass over. There was a condition to his mercy, a condition to his grace, and that was that they do what he had told them to do, that he followed the law that he had set before them, that they get the lamb, slay the lamb in the appropriate way at the appropriate time, and put the blood on the doorpost. We're not told what happened to those that didn't put blood on the doorpost, but any reader of Scripture would know undoubtedly what happened. But we're told what did happen to those that followed his will, did as the Lord had commanded them to do, that they were brought out of Egypt. They were redeemed. The Lord passed over them. Their firstborn were not killed. He showed them mercy. He showed them grace. He showed them the benefit of his goodness while he brought severe judgment and punishment on the land of Egypt. He was there to destroy Egypt, to judge Egypt, to strike the land of Egypt. But he was going to spare his people. But they not only needed to be in mind his people, they needed to be in action his people. They needed to do what he had asked them to do. Now, this idea of a memorial is used here in this verse, but it's also used in a number of other places in our context, but not only in the idea of a memorial or something that to be remembered, but also in another way, because there's a number of places in this context where we see the Lord saying to the children of Israel that when your children shall say, what does this mean? Or when your son shall ask, why have you done this? You need to be ready to explain it. You need to be able to say, this is the reason. It harkens back to a time when we were in Egypt and we were delivered out of Egypt. And that's why we keep this feast. That's why we keep this memorial. That's why we do what we're told to do here, is because we want to remember what it is that the Lord has done for us. Now, I've got there chapter 13 and verse 3 beside of it also mentioned chapter 2 and verse 24. And chapter 2 and verse 24 reads, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. You see, God uses the same word here in chapter 13 to describe how he wants the children of Israel to remember this event, him passing over, him delivering them out of Egypt. He wants them to use it in the same way in which he remembered his covenant with the fathers, with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And he wants them to remember it with their children in exactly the same way. Now, one of the things that I had put in the notes for this week was a comment from the commentary by Sarna, specifically on this idea of remembrance. And he says, and I quote, the Hebrew stem connotes much more than the recall of things past. It means rather to be mindful, to pay heed, signifying a sharp focus of attention upon someone or something. It embraces concern and involvement and is active, not passive, so that it eventuates in action. End of the quote. The idea there is that this remembrance is just something that comes to our mind once in a while, but rather it brings about action. Action in what we do, how we prepare ourselves to serve the Lord, how we indeed serve the Lord, how we're diligent in doing it when he says to do it, in the way he says to do it, such that we'll be pleasing to him. So this idea of remembrance or memorial brings out this idea of not only remembering what God had done for them, but remembering that it was God's remembrance of their plight and their situation and the promise that he had made that was even bringing about this deliverance. But also for those of us that are Christians and thinking about this in our day and time, we can think about a couple other passages. In John 1:29, we read something that helps us think about this as we see this Passover, this lamb that was sacrificed and this blood that was present, and how it would ultimately redeem the children of Israel, save the children of Israel in this situation. We see John saying, as he sees Christ coming, in John 1:29, the next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him, saith, behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. Harking back to this idea of a lamb, and the sacrifice of a lamb provided the blood whereby they would be passed over, they would be saved, they would be redeemed. Or we can go to 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, and the 7th verse, which touches upon other aspects of this idea of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread that we'll talk about in a few moments. But notice what it says in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. The idea that Christ was a sacrifice in the same way in which this sacrifice was made at the time of the Passover. A connection there, something for us to remember. And so we can think about that when we think about the memorials or the remembrance that we are given in the New Testament that we're to do on a regular basis, weekly. on the first day of the week, that remembrance that we're to have of Christ and his sacrifice. So you see the tie in there, and hopefully you'll see that in regards to all these things and how they apply to us as Christians as we read these passages and see these words and these concepts and these ideas that are included in this section regarding the Passover and the 10th plague. The next section here is talking about the service to the Lord, and we'll go to chapter 12, verses 25 through 26. And it says, "And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service." Talking about what it is they were to do here in regards to specifically the Passover. And as he's about to give them the idea of the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. "And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?'" That's that idea I mentioned earlier about the idea of remembrance. So that not only was it a memory for those who it was given to, but it was a memory for all of Israel, for the congregation of Israel, for the people of Israel, for all the generations, because it would be told from one to the next. Each parent would be responsible for telling their children, this is what this service means. Now, as we look at that, I want you to think about this idea of service. Here it's being used in regards to keeping this feast, in regards to doing what they needed to do before the 10th plague would come so that they could be spared the death that was promised to come upon Egypt. And this was a service to the Lord. This was doing what it is that he wants us to do. That word brings forth the idea of labor or a work, or even more specifically, the idea of a usefulness, to serve a purpose, to serve. This word is also used in chapter 1 and verse 14. Chapter 1 and verse 14 reads, and this is in regards to the Egyptians and how they treated the children of Israel. "And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." Exact same idea. So the Egyptians made them to serve. God was releasing them from that service, but that didn't mean that they could just do nothing. No, he released them from that service to the Egyptians so that they might serve him. They were no longer going to serve the king of Egypt. They were going to serve the one true and living God. They were going to look to him as their king, as we could read later on in the history of Israel, and see that he was intended to be their king. And they rejected that at some point in time. But the point being here is that they were going to be released from their service to the king of Egypt so that they might serve the Lord, that they might be of service to him, that they might do what it is he had asked them to do, what he had commanded them to do. So we see that's mentioned there in chapter 1 and verse 14, also mentioned here in the passage we just read, and also be mentioned again in chapter 13 and verse 5, where it talks about service. Another idea here is the idea of preparation. Let's read in chapter 12 and verse 28. "And the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they." So not only does it say that they bowed down and worshiped him, as we read earlier, and not only they did what he commanded, but they went away and did exactly what they needed to do to be prepared and ready for what was about to happen. Notice in verse 35 and 36, "And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. And they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver, jewels of gold, and raiment. And the Lord gave people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians." Let's go back to another verse here in chapter 12, verse 15. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. On the first day ye shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Here's another idea of preparation. They were to remove all leaven from their houses. So as we look at this idea of preparation, as we think about preparation and serving the Lord, let's look at all the things that they were commanded to do here. They were to select a lamb on the 10th day so that they could sacrifice on the 14th day. They were to remove leaven from their house. They were to put blood on the door. They were to cook this lamb in a particular way. They prepare their bread in a particular way. They were to even dress in a particular way to represent that they were ready to leave Egypt, that they were ready to leave in haste. They were to eat it in a particular way with particular, as one commentator said, side dishes, the bitter herbs. They were to do these things in a particular way. They were also to go and borrow of the Egyptians so that they could indeed spoil the Egyptians, as had been prophesied back in Genesis 15 and 14, when the Lord told Abraham that they would come out with great substance. So you see all this preparation that has gone on. The Lord has done all these things to prepare the children of Israel. But here the children of Israel, in order to worship the Lord, in order to keep his law, in order to receive his grace, his mercy, and to be passed over by the death that was going to be brought upon the firstborn, they had all these things they were to prepare, all these things that they were to do in order to be pleasing to him. I don't know that we think enough in our day and our time about the preparation that should go into us being ready to serve the Lord. But you see here a great example of it in the children of Israel, not only in what they did, but in what the Lord told them they needed to do. Look at the detail that is provided here. Look at the things they had to have ready so that they could worship the Lord as he wanted them to worship them, so that they could be ready to leave Egypt, so that they would be ready for the 10th plague. There's a lot of preparation that goes into our worship. There's a lot of preparation that goes into being ready to worship as a congregation of the Lord. We need to think about that, and we need to recognize that preparation, but we need to also ask ourselves the question, are we really prepared for what the Lord has asked for us to do so that we might be favorable in his sight, that we might do those things which are pleasing to him? So really we could summarize chapter 12 as being the Passover, the Lord giving Moses the ordinances, the statutes, the commands for what they were to do in preparation for the Passover. Moses telling the children of Israel what they were to do in preparing for the Passover. The children of Israel doing what Moses had told them to do in preparation for the Passover. And then ultimately the Passover. Now the Passover is remembered by the children of Israel as this great event where they were spared death. But when you read in chapter 12 how the Egyptians saw it, they saw it as what it indeed was, a judgment upon them. And it says in verse 30 of chapter 12 that there is not a single house where there was not one that was dead. And they called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Rise up and get forth among your people, both you and your children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as ye have said. Take your flocks and your herds as ye have said, and be gone." And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We be all dead." So we see here that it had its intended purpose, this final plague, and that was that the Egyptians and Pharaoh drove the children of Israel out. But they didn't drive them out before they had given them what they had requested of them and what the Lord had told them to request them, that they might go out with the substance that he had promised that they would go out with from the land of Israel. As we turn to chapter 13, we see here in verse 2 where the Lord speaks to Moses and says, "Sanctify unto me all the firstborn whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast, it is mine." Why could God claim the firstborn? Why was it that he could say to Moses to set these individuals apart? And we'll talk about this whole idea of sanctifying the firstborn and how that enters into the children of Israel and how they worship God in a later chapter. But here he says to sanctify or to set apart, or your translation may say to consecrate or to make holy to me the firstborn. How could he claim that? Because he had spared them, because he had provided to Israel what they needed in order to avoid the death of the firstborn. And so as a result of that, the firstborn both of man and of beast was dedicated to the Lord. And we see here in this chapter some specifics about that. And we'll understand more about that as we go on in later chapters, and we'll talk about it some more. But here the idea is that they were sanctified. They were indeed set apart. Now, if we go back to Genesis, the 2nd chapter, and the 3rd verse, we'll see something regarding this idea of sanctification. And it brings about an idea for us that we're going to talk about when we talk about the 10 Commandments, when we talk about the law that is given on Sinai. But notice in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3, "And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it," same word, "because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." So just as God had sanctified and made holy the 7th day, here in Genesis, the 2nd chapter and the 3rd verse, just as he had sanctified it and set it apart, made it holy, here they were to sanctify and set apart the firstborn. In verse 12 it says, "And thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all that openeth the matrix, and every firstling that cometh of a beast which thou hast. The male shall be the Lord's. They shall belong to the Lord." So they're holy, they're consecrated to the Lord, they're for the Lord's purpose. And we're going to say, as we go on in Exodus, we'll see more about this brought about. But the idea here is that they belong to the Lord. Let's look also in chapter 13 and verse 9. "And it shall be a sign unto thee upon thine hand, and a memorial between thy eyes, that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth, for a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt." The Lord had brought them out. He had shown his power and his might. They were to worship him in the way that he wanted to be worshiped. And a part of that command, a part of that law that was given to them, was they were to sanctify their firstborn. But notice also what it says here in regards to the things that were to be done. They were not only to be a memorial and to be remembered as a sign upon the hand and upon as frontlets between their eyes, but there's a purpose in that the Lord's law may be in thy mouth. Remember what we said earlier about when your children ask this, what shall you say? Here's how you're supposed to explain it. You're supposed to explain it in the words which God has given. The law is supposed to be in your mouth so that when the appropriate time comes, you need to say back that law. You need to speak that law. You need to tell your children and others about that law. You need to constantly remember what the Lord has done for you and speak it. It needs to come out of your mouth. Well, I think it gets us pretty much to the end here of what we want to talk about today. But with this chart still up, I want to ask a few questions. And I just want us to think about something in regards to these lessons that we have from this series of passages on the Passover and the 10th plague. How do we look at the law of the Lord? How do we look at his statutes, his ordinances, that which we're told to do? Do we take it and do it as the children of Israel did here? There's a time that'll come later on when they will not do it, and we see how God responds to them when they fail to do his law. But here they do his law, and because of that, they receive his grace and his mercy. They see his love. God's grace and God's mercy is not unconditional. There are things he wants us to do. That doesn't mean that we necessarily get his grace and his mercy, because that's his choice to give. But he does ask us to do these things, just as he asked the children of Israel here to do things. And they did them, and were pleasing to him. How do we look at the Lord's people? Do we look at it as a community, a congregation? I was thinking about this as we were preparing this lesson, and thinking about the circumstances and the situation we're in. You notice here that he calls the people of the Lord here, the children of Israel, the congregation of Israel. And yet, as they partook Passover, because of the circumstances, because of the situation, they were each in their individual house, unless they were a small enough family that they could join with another family and be with them. But they were to be in their house individually. They didn't do it all together as a congregation. But yet it says here in the language of the text that they were to partake of it as a congregation. They were the Lord's people, even though they couldn't at that particular time be in one place at one time. They were nevertheless the Lord's people. Just as because of circumstances today, we can't all be together. We're still the Lord's people. We're still the Lord's people in the sense of all those that are of the seed of Abraham by faith, but also we're the Lord's people in a particular place, in the community we're in, those who we have selected to join ourselves together with to worship the Lord. We're still the congregation of the Lord here in this place, even though we can't all be in the same building today. How do we remember the Lord? Do we indeed think about the things that he has told us to remember? Do we keep the memorials of the Lord as he has asked us to do them? Do we do so in such a way that our children will ask us what it is we're doing and why we do it? And can we explain those things based upon the law of the Lord? Is that how we keep in remembrance the things that we have been told and look forward to the things that are promised to us in the future, just as the children of Israel could? What's our service like to the Lord? Do we work for the Lord? Do we labor for the Lord? Do we do what he asks us to do? Do we consider the things that he's asked us to do a service? Do we consider them a sacrifice to him? How to prepare to worship the Lord? How do we prepare to keep the memorial of the Lord? How do we prepare to keep his law? Do we pay attention to the details? Do we look at what he's commanded us to do? Do we do it exactly as he's asked us to do it so that we'll be pleasing to him? Do we sanctify the things? Do we make holy the things the Lord wants us to make holy? Are we the sanctified people of God? Are we those that are set apart to his purpose? We need to ask ourselves all these questions, because you see, these are the words that are used. We all remember the Passover, and we remember the 10th plague, and we remember those events in this section. But I think it's useful for us also to think about these other words and these concepts and these ideas that are used in this story of the Passover and this idea of the 10th plague, and think about how these things apply to us and how they can guide us and how we live our life today. That's the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate those of you who have passed along comments regarding the class. I'd encourage you to go onto the website and to look up the materials that are there if you haven't already. Try each week to provide for you ahead of time a list of questions and a page of thoughts that can go with it so you can be prepared for this lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions. May the Lord bless you, and may the Lord keep you. Thank you.